Hello and welcome into the best in paranormal talk radio. This is Beyond the Darkness. I'm Tim Dennison again for Dave Schrader, who is on his way to Eureka Springs, Arkansas. That's where you can check him out this weekend. He's there with Sean Paul and the rest of the kids from Intrigue Theater, including who I like to consider a close personal friend, Frankie the Monkey. He'll be there as well this weekend at the Eureka Springs Hotel. You can check it out by going to darknessevents.com. If you're in the area this weekend, be sure to check it out. Be sure to get to the event. I don't think the event is sold out quite yet. It might be, but check it out. Darknessevents.com. See if you can get in for the weekend. There's lots of great stuff going on. Some old-time spiritualist stuff going on, as well as some ghost hunts and stuff going on at the Crescent Hotel there in Eureka Springs, Arkansas. You can still catch up with Dave there. Although be careful if you're going to go around him, wear a mask because he's still, I think, a little contagious. He's got the man flu, and that man flu could potentially bring down, I believe, Rome, I think is what it brought down back in old times, because it's put him out here for the last couple of days. So, yeah, I like to give him crap about it. His penance for making me do the show for the last 2 days, by the way, folks, don't tell him yet because I'm getting ready to tell him. He absolutely hates Steely Dan. So this morning, what I did was there was an announcement or a pre-sale for Steely Dan and the Doobie Brothers, his two favorite groups, this summer at XL. So I bought tickets for the two of us. So we're going to go see Steely Dan and the Doobie Brothers in June. I know he's absolutely going to hate it, but he's going to have to go. That's his penance for making me do the show for the last 2 days. He's going to enjoy every minute. I'm sure he will. We've got a great show this evening, folks. We've got not only Chad Lewis with us today, but we've got a great Theater of the Mind coming up here in the middle of the show. So stay tuned for that as well. Our guest today is Chad Lewis. He's got a brand new book out called The Most Gruesome Hauntings of the Midwest. And actually, I misspeak here, don't I, Chad? It's not brand new, but it's an exciting book nonetheless, right?
It's going to be new for a lot of your listeners.
There you go. Sure. There you go. It's and tell me a little bit about the setting for this here now, Chad. You do write a lot about the Midwest, correct?
I do. I'm from Wisconsin originally, and I think
what?
Midwest may be the weirdest place ever.
Can I set something up here? I had no idea. Okay, so I'm talking to Chad. I feel embarrassed now. I'm talking to Chad before the show, and I'm telling him about. Oh my gosh, I'm really embarrassed now. Okay, I'm going to set something up here for our audience, Chad. So I'm talking to Chad before the show, and I have this little joke with our audience where I talk about people from Wisconsin. Now, I did three years of radio in Wisconsin, and I'll admit I do have a fondness for Wisconsin, Chad. I do. I did 3 years of radio in Wisconsin, but I like to rib people from Wisconsin because they're avid Packer fans, and they like to shove it in my face about my love for the Minnesota Vikings. So my comeback for them is that there are only two types of people from Wisconsin, Packer fans and serial killers, and you can't tell the difference between the two. And that tends to get our audience going, right? I had no idea you were from Wisconsin. So I feel embarrassed for actually throwing that.
If it makes you feel better, I did spend a decade living in Minneapolis until they kicked me out for being too weird and sent me back to Wisconsin. So,
so which did you enjoy more? Probably Wisconsin, right?
Well, I love Minnesota. I didn't really care for the big size of Minneapolis and the surrounding area. I lived there for a decade, and to this day, I still couldn't name some of the suburbs. I'd use my GPS because it's just gigantic when you're there. So I do like a smaller place, but I love Minnesota. I'm in Minnesota right now up in the Northwoods doing some lecturing. So you're hard-pressed not to get me out of Minnesota.
Well, and that was very diplomatic of you to kind of throw both around. And you know what? I've always, I grew up in Minnesota. I grew up in the suburbs of Minneapolis, and I don't know. I've always been very fond of it. No matter where I've gone, no matter where I've traveled, I've always come back, and it's always felt like home. The only other place, I guess, that I've traveled to that's really felt like home for me has been Colorado. I mean, that area to me, whenever I go there, feels like home as well. So it to me, I don't know. But I did have, and I've told you this off air, and I'll tell it, and I've told it once on air too. There's one area that I don't mind mentioning to anybody. I'll mention it to them here, there, or anywhere, where I had a genuine creepy feeling while living there. And I didn't live there very long, but it was Stewart, Iowa. I was doing radio there, and everybody looked at me strangely, and everybody kind of walked around in this zombie-like haze. I just got the weirdest feeling from being in Stewart, Iowa. There was an episode of X-Files, the first run, the original series, where Mulder was in this town and everybody was kind of walking around like zombies. And I got that feeling for 3 months. I was never comfortable in this town. And I just, that's kind of what I kind of drew the parallel to Stewart, Iowa. I couldn't wait to be out of there. I don't know what it was. I think
a lot of people share that experience, whether it's a restaurant they go to, a hotel, or some town they're visiting for vacation. Just something doesn't seem right, and it doesn't set with them, and they want to get out of there.
Well, and that's absolutely true. And I kind of I think too when you there's a subject in your book, and we'll get into it here in a bit, where when you're driving through certain areas of Wisconsin, let's get into it now. When you're talking about Ed Gein, okay, and you're driving in that area of Wisconsin, you kind of, I think you set yourself up for it, don't you? Where you're driving through those backwoods of Wisconsin, and you go, oh gosh, this could be that area, or this could be that. You set yourself up, and it sets that. You're playing upon your own fears, or you're getting yourself psyched up for something that, let's face it, realistically probably isn't going to happen.
Very true. A lot of people, when they're traveling the back roads, which is why I always recommend taking the back roads, they get a sense of uneasiness. And it's a sense that's unfounded, because Ed Gein, maybe his spirit, but certainly not him, is going to come out of his old farmstead and come after you. That's very rare. So you have the relative safety of being in your vehicle or wherever you are, but a lot of people come up with these almost zones of fear where they're driving through a place, and all of a sudden their imagination or psychic ability, whatever it may be, takes off, and all of a sudden they're very fearful and going a little faster than they normally would.
Now, I got to ask you this. As far as that area of Wisconsin, it's been, how many years has it been now since Ed Gein's left us and that property's been burned down? It was
1957 when Gein was captured and discovered that he was digging up bodies at the local graveyard for over a decade and using them for furniture and other purposes in his farm. And his house, before they were going to open it as a museum of horrors that you could go and visit, like some roadside attraction, it mysteriously burned to the ground, although many people told me the townsfolk actually burned it before anyone could do something with it. So the land is still there. Every few years it does pop up on the market, but it doesn't sell because the owners want about 3 times the price of what it should be assessed at, because they believe having the Gein history actually increases the value of the land.
And obviously, according to the MLS and appraisers and in logic, it doesn't. Correct.
Yeah, exactly. A lot of people, unless you have a really macabre sense of adventure, most people try to stay away from places like that.
But is there anything on the land right now?
No, it's a farmland right now, but people still have a ton of experiences there. In fact, when I first went there over 2 decades ago, I brought 2 psychics with me. intuitives who believed they could pick up on these spirits, and they had no idea where we were. They just thought we were in the middle of nowhere, Wisconsin, where Plainfield is. Mm-hmm. But as soon as we pulled up to the makeshift area next to the farm, they refused to get out of the car because they were picking up on too much negative energy. They were picking up on a sense of dread that they shouldn't be there, and they didn't want to get out of the car. With no history of the place that I knew of that they had. And people still make a pilgrimage there every year. I just recently had a woman ask me if I'd ever heard of anyone being cursed from going to Ed Gein's farm. And then she told me that when she went to visit on her way home, she struck a deer and then was sideswiped by a vehicle and then ran out of gas all in the same way on her way home. She thought she was cursed from visiting Gein's farm.
Jeez, all in the same trip, huh?
Yeah, her car, eventually she gave up and called a friend to come and get her. And people that do visit Gein's farm, they'll often hear disembodied cries of women thought to be his victims. Some have said they've seen someone that appears to be Gein himself walking around on the old farmland and then disappearing right into thin air.
Has it ever, to your knowledge, has it ever been proposed by someone to buy the land and maybe even recreate the Gein house or try to build a reasonable facsimile to bring back the history? Because it seems like enough time has passed. I mean, even from 1957, where much like the Villisca Axe House or some of those other museums now, quote unquote, I guess you could call them museums or historic places. You would think that there would be an attraction where people would want to see that from around the country, and that there would be some sort of macabre fascination, that there would be something that would want to bring tourism to Plainfield, and that maybe the community would want to embrace it a little bit rather than shun it. Has anything been proposed like that?
I'm absolutely surprised that no one has opened this place up, because it would be a huge moneymaker. But to this day, the townsfolk really do not like talking about it. That when you go there to some of the sites where Gein visited, some of the sites where he actually took one of his living victims from, they don't want to talk about their grisly history. Even though most of the people associated with the case and the families are long gone, it doesn't seem like it's been quite long enough for the community to embrace it, much like you mentioned the Villisca Axe Murder House, which is a huge tourist draw and a huge moneymaker for the owner and the community in Villisca, Iowa.
You know, it's interesting. I had just run across a special last weekend on Ed Gein, and it caught my attention. I don't know what it is about that case. I guess that case really has sparked a lot of stuff in Hollywood, and a lot of different creative minds have taken that case and spun it into a lot of popular movies, and even incorporated it into a lot of popular movies, including stuff like Silence of the Lambs and different books and movies. And you know, as you look at different photos, even still photos, and they talk about how kind this guy is. I believe his best friend is still alive, and was doing interviews for this special, and he was talking about how strong Ed was. He was talking about how, oh yeah, you know, Ed could pick up a 120, 130 pound sack of oats and just throw it over his shoulder like it was nothing. And but yet he was just the kind of guy who, oh yeah, if someone had to go out and do something, they would just give their kids to Ed to watch for the afternoon or for the evening like it was nothing. And you look at Ed, and he really did have kind of a kind, trusting face. It was just that people just thought of him as being socially awkward.
He was well-liked in Plainfield, as you said, odd but well-liked. He would babysit for kids, and he'd bring his neighbors over what he called a venison stew for them to eat. Mm-hmm. I had one neighbor told me he remembered his mother getting this stew, and it had such a terrible smell she threw it away, which was a good idea for her. But when Ed was captured, believe it or not, they somehow thought he was insane, so they sent him to an insane asylum. And I talked to several nurses that worked with him on the floor he was on, and they said at a distance, Ed looked like this unassuming, grandfatherly type guy. But when you got close to him and started really looking at him, they could see something wasn't quite right in him. And when you read the doctor's interrogation or interview of Geen, you'll see that he was very childlike. He said he didn't remember much of what happened. He was in a daze. He couldn't recall why he did the things he did, probably out of embarrassment of that time. But he claimed that much of it, he seemed to be in some type of daze while it was going on.
And to kind of add to that, there's one still photo they showed of him that kind of backs that. He's kind of looking off into the distance, and it is kind of a childlike look, but yet he does look like he's in a daze. And I think it was shortly after they captured him, because it looks like his hands might be behind his back at the time. But he looks almost surprised, shocked, like, what is everybody doing here? What what's happening to me type of thing. And he almost looks innocent. You can almost see why people would think, oh, you know what, he's socially awkward. It's just poor Eddie. It's just, leave him alone type of thing. Or it's poor Eddie. It's not, he's perfectly harmless. You can tell why the townsfolk would think that way about this guy. But as they were detailing things about his life, his relationship with his mother was real, and that's where the details from the movie Psycho really come from. His relationship with his mother was really quite strange as well, wasn't it?
It was. Some people tried to say that it was an incestual relationship, which we don't have any proof of. And now that looking back, a lot of psychologists and psychiatrists wonder if Geen was suffering from some sort of gender identity disorder, that what he would often do with these bodies is make, outside of putting them into lampshades and furniture and the like, he had a complete outfit made of human material, if you will, complete with female sexual organs, and he would wear it as he danced around in the moonlight in his front yard. And many people believe he may have thought that he was a woman or wanted to be a woman, or in today's world, would have transformed into a woman. But back in the 50s, that was unheard of. So that's one theory thrown out to explain what Geen was doing. But what I found is that researching so many of these serial killers or just murderers is that many of them, when captured, do seem like they're in some type of fog or trance. And it'd be fascinating to find out if some of these really were in some sort of trance or uncontrolled in their actions.
Yeah, it's a fascinating case with Ed Gein. What is the fascination that draws us to Ed Gein, other than the macabre part of it, yet pushes away the people of Wisconsin? Why do they push back so hard against the history of Ed Gein?
I think it's a quiet area, a lot of farm community, rural community. They don't like the attention, and they'd rather put it behind them. They don't like the fuss. I often wonder if it was something positive that happened to the town, if they'd want something to do with that. And I'm thinking they probably wouldn't even want to exploit that. But what I think fascinates us all these years later about Geen, because certainly every single day people are doing more horrific things than Geen did every single day, and they're just forgotten about. But Geen, it was one of the first times that something that horrific made the newspapers. And remember, in the 50s, these stories would stick around for a while. We didn't have the 24-hour or whatever 6-hour news cycle we have now. So people would follow the Geen story. And I had many people tell me that they recalled when they saw Geen in the newspapers that that's the first time they remember their parents locking their front door from all over the country. That until that time, nobody locked the front door. And I've also been following that many kids of the time started telling jokes about Geen. There were a ton of jokes going through the nation as a way to help deal with what was going on, because this really was the first time something like this had happened. And the other thing, too, is if you go to Wikipedia or you go to Google and you look at how Ed Gein has influenced current musical culture, film culture, it seems like just when it subsides or just when you
you think that the name Ed Gein has disappeared from culture, a brand new generation comes back and brings it back for, even if it's just for shock value within their art. You look at, you look at different musical genres, even punk music brought the name back as something shocking. And then alternative music brings it back. It seems like generation after generation, there's some song that references Ed Gein or John Wayne Gacy or some serial killer, and tries to put a new spin on them in order to keep the name alive. And it's interesting that they keep reaching back to these stories to bring them forward, to keep the names alive in a bizarre way, and that I suppose even you could argue that even shows like this do that as well from time to time. But what is it that we're learning from it by bringing the macabre forward, in your opinion?
Well, I think it's a better understanding of looking at why these people do it. But for me, we may never explain that. We just don't know why some people do what they do, and we may never know that. But for me, I'm fascinated in the ramifications and the effects of what they do. And times change. Back in the 50s, after Gein was captured, his vehicle that he used to drive down to the cemeteries to dig up these recently deceased bodies of women that reminded him of his mother, that went on display at carnivals and circus sideshows. You could pay a few dollars or whatever it was and go sit inside his vehicle and look at it. And then the vehicle went missing. And I recently had someone tell me that they told me that they have an idea of where his vehicle is, but they never followed up on it. So we may never know. Now, when Dahmer, another Wisconsin resident, Jeffrey Dahmer, when his stuff came up for auction, a very wealthy person bought a lot of his memorabilia and had it destroyed, so nothing like that could happen.
You draw an interesting parallel, and that's actually where I was going to go next. You take decades later, you take Jeffrey Dahmer. We are in that news cycle at that point. We are in the 24-hour news cycle. And here's a story that, while not really similar, happened in a well-populated area, in the Milwaukee area. Has a different spin, I guess, and a different motive, yet has as much traction, if not more, than Ed Gein. Why the macabre fascination with Jeffrey Dahmer as much as Ed Gein? Why do we hold on to Jeffrey Dahmer, especially, and even if we want to look at just Wisconsin and then nationally? Why are we holding on to Jeffrey Dahmer as hard as we hold on to Ed Gein? In that sense, is it necessarily the way it happened, the macabre sense of how it happened? What is the psychology there that oh my God, it's happened again? But in the way that it happened, why did Jeffrey Dahmer not slip under the radar? Why is he maintained the same way Ed Gein has?
I think it's several things. One, I think Dahmer was so unique in the fact that he was trying to make love slaves and capturing these, and we can't rule out the fact that his sexual orientation had a big factor on that. I believe if Jeffrey Dahmer was straight and killing prostitutes or female victims, it might have gone under the radar more than the scandalousness of it being a gay man doing it to other gay men. I think that had a great impact on the psyche. And also, they had recently, a few years ago, they had tried to put together a Dahmer haunted tour that would take you to some of the clubs where he picked up his victims and show you all these locations. And there was an uproar over that because, much like the rest of the world, Milwaukee wanted to distance itself from Dahmer to the point where they tore down his entire apartment complex to get rid of it so nobody could come and visit. So I think there's that fascination because Dahmer was just as bizarre, thinking he was trying to make love zombies, that like Gein, that I think it sticks with us.
It's interesting that, you draw the parallel. In England, you have the Jack the Ripper tour, yet in Wisconsin, you're doing everything you can to get away from that history. And even though it's recent history, it seems like there's not going to be an industry around its macabre center. They're not going to build that type of history. We're going to focus on the positive, not the negative. And to me, it seems like there could be quite a bit of tourism to be built around that, yet they refuse to embrace it. And maybe that speaks to the heart of the people, because they are good people in Wisconsin, and they don't want to be associated with it.
And it could be a learning experience as well, that you set these tours up not only to kind of dig into the grisly history, but as a learning experience as well. But I think that's changing a bit. Back in 2002, when I was doing a book on Wisconsin ghosts, no matter where I went, whether it was a B&B, a restaurant, a hotel, whatever it was, they would say, don't put us in your book, because if people find out we're haunted, nobody's going to come here. But then they finally said, go ahead, nobody's going to read your book anyway. And now I get emails from those same businesses saying, thank you for putting us in the book, because it's paranormal tourism, that people do want to go to these places. And in a world where you can go to any town of decent size and see the same restaurants, the same hotels, the same businesses, people are looking for something unique, even if that is bizarre.
When do you suppose, Chad, that worm turned? When do you think that paranormal tourism deal started to really kick in? Was it 2000, the mid 2000s, end of the 2000s? Is that when that really started to kick in? 2006, 2008, 2009?
I think that's when it was ramped up quite a bit. When a lot of the TV shows came out in the media, people were following the path of these roadside attractions. And there's a series of wonderful books, my favorite books, called Oddball, and they have one for most states. Jerome Poland's the author, and Oddball Minnesota, Oddball Wisconsin, Colorado. You get the idea. And these were books that would tell you how to get to roadside attractions, the biggest ball of twine, Judy Garland's birthplace, things of that nature. And people loved doing this. And I think the paranormal just kind of followed in that footstep, saying, we're really missing out on a market here, because if we're a haunted hotel and somebody does not believe in ghosts, that's not going to scare them away, but it will attract people who are looking for that type of adventure.
It seems like the Midwest has quite a bit of these hauntings going on, and famous hauntings at that. Why is the Midwest such a magnet for the macabre and a magnet for these famous hauntings?
I think two things. One is, I think we have a lot of researchers investigating these cases that bring them out, that there may be a lot of weirdness happening other places, but not as many people are collecting these stories and actively researching them. Also, there may be something just in the makeup of our people here that we feel more comfortable coming forward with these stories, that we feel like we're going to be taken seriously, that we're not going to be made a fool of because we saw something in the woods or in the sky or in our own homes, that people feel comfortable. So I think it's the combination of people telling these stories and then somebody there to record them.
Now, you say we're more comfortable, but are we? Are these the type of stories, when they're told to you or when you're researching them, that they're kind of told under the breath? Or hey, you know what, I got a story for you, but don't tell anybody type of deal? Or is it something where people are proud of the heritage, so they do want to tell them to you? What kind of climate are we really living in now?
20-some years ago, when I first started doing this, it was always when I told somebody I was researching this, they would look around and in hushed tones say, this is the story I have, or this is the story my grandmother had. Whereas today, when I'm doing a lecture and there's 100 people or what be it in the audience, I might get 15 new stories from people who just matter of fact say, I saw a UFO, or I believe I was abducted, or I saw a Bigfoot creature in the woods, without any hesitation, because I think it has become so much of a part of the public and just general everyday goings-ons that people feel comfortable talking about it. Every movie out there seems to have a paranormal twist to it. Every new TV show on the networks seem to have a paranormal turn to it. So I think it's just part of the general public's consciousness now.
I got to ask you this. Of all the states in the Midwest, what is the most flamboyant state? The one that seems to be the most proud of their ghost stories or their macabre stories that are out there?
I would say Minnesota, right up there with Iowa, believe it or not. But Minnesota has such a wealth of weirdness, from the Wendigo creature to haunted roadside attractions to mysterious creatures that are not found anywhere else, it seems, in the United States. So I love Minnesota because they have the native peoples there, a lot of stories surrounding them. They have the gangster history there in St. Paul and the Northwoods. So it's a combination of the pioneers of the area, makes for some really, really interesting stories.
Interesting. Well, I tell you what, let's take a break right now and let's delve into one of those stories and join our weekly feature. This is the Theater of the Mind.
The doors to the dark eyes have been blown open by monstrous mischief in today's Theater of the Mind, a real-life encounter brought to you by Roland Carlson, Melonhead Melee. When I was 19 years old, I had become too old for trick-or-treating, and my best friend Mike and I were looking for something to do around Halloween. We both lived in Newbury, Ohio, a small farming town located in northeast Ohio. Due to the town's small size, there wasn't much to do as far as haunted houses or parties that we could have attended. But there was one thing our area had that always intrigued me: the tale of the Melonhead House. In short, how the legend was told to me as a teenager was that a local retired doctor at a Cleveland hospital had several kids he adopted over time. In his retirement from medicine, he began to experiment on these children, or something, trying to find a way to cure death. But his experiments, they ended in tragedy, as his kids' heads became swollen, hence the nickname Melonheads. Some of the kids who he experimented with moved into the woods upon the doctor's death. All of this madness apparently took place at a house in Kirtland, Ohio, a house that is now abandoned. There's an abandoned house that was mistakenly identified as the Melon House, houses that teenagers love to party at, but very few people knew where the actual property was located. One of those few people was Mike's dad. He was a prominent land developer in the area. After expressing our lack of plans for Halloween, his dad eventually shared with us the location of the actual Melonhead property. Not thinking we believed the legend or would go as far to seek out the exact house, being scared by the story but longing for adventure, the two of us agreed to go check out the property. We decided to go there the night before Halloween because it was a Saturday and we would be able to stay out later. We left Mike's house around 7:45 p.m. It was fairly dark, and while Mike remained positive we would find the property, I remained a bit skeptical and figured we would just be going out for a fun nighttime ride. We took my car, which was my life at the time, a 2007 silver Dodge Charger, which I treated like a child and always locked when exiting. After a 20-minute ride, we pulled up to the wooded area that seemed neglected by time. I wasn't fond of the trip already due to the fact that I had to take my car off the road into a grass field to access the area we were traveling to. As our headlights illuminated the wooded area, I could make out what I thought resembled an old weathered rock path that once must have been a driveway or some sort of walkway. I was always worried about getting in trouble, as my parents were strict, and while Mike's parents knew we were there, my parents assumed I was spending the night playing games inside Mike's house. Knowing that we would most likely be in an area restricted to the public, I begged Mike to get back in the car and return home with me before we got into trouble. I was much more scared of my parents than the possibility of exploring the Melonhead house, but that would soon change. I didn't want to ruin Mike's night, though I planned on leaving as soon as I could talk him into it. Before we began our journey, I pulled my car behind a natural dirt mound and a large tree to hide from anyone's view to avoid more trouble. We walked over to my car and grabbed our supplies from the back seat. I then did something I had done 1,000 times before. I watched my headlights flash as I locked my car. I loved that car. It was my first car, so I always made sure it was locked. Before venturing off into the woods, we both turned on flashlights we brought with us. I also changed into long pants because his dad described the property as a wooded area, and I had a fear of snakes. As we ventured into the woods to the ruins of the house, I realized how isolated we really were. Growing up in the country, I was always used to wide-open, unpopulated areas, but this was different. There were no lights from other houses. There were no objects or familiarity such as a main road or a house to run to if something went wrong. Just dense woods that my little flashlight seemed to have no effect on. I never feared actually running into the melonheads. I was just always afraid of the dark, and this was beyond the amount of darkness I ever could imagine. I remember telling Mike that if he tried to spook me, I'd run off and drive home without him. Eventually, we got to the ruins, the first of which was a pillar or support beam to an old barn or something. It amazed me that something could have once been built in these dark woods, and that someone could actually live in this dark, isolated area. I couldn't turn back now because I wouldn't make it through the woods alone. I had to go where Mike was going, and he wanted to move forward. After going down hills a short way, I finally saw it. I'm positive about very few things in life, but I'm positive I will never forget what our flashlights shined on. About 20 yards away from where we stood was a structure. I wouldn't call it a house because no one could inhabit it in its current state. The structure had no roof, and jagged edges were pointing out from what I assume were the remains of a second story. It had walls that were missing panels, and it looked to be consumed by the woods. I remember screaming something I can't say on the radio, and closing my eyes and wishing we were back at Mike's house. I wanted to have an adventure, just not actually find something in those woods. As Mike and I stepped into what we could only assume was the front of the structure, we saw many objects, but one caught my eye. An old pair of jeans with reddish, orangish brown stains on them. They were half buried in the ground, and I pretended to be super interested in them in hopes Mike would explore the rest of the house while I looked at the jeans. I'm not the wear jeans to show how country I am kind of guy, but these weathered old jeans with that weird color stain, they may have been a perfect pair of pants for a Halloween scarecrow that we planned to display at Mike's house for Halloween. I pulled them up from the earth and carried them with me as Mike and I made our way back through the dark forest to my car. As we emerged out of the woods, I remember laughing as I felt finally free, and then I could see my car. Mike ran ahead of me and, to my absolute shock, opened the passenger door before I got there. I know to this day that I 100% locked that car, and looking back, that should have been my first clue that something wasn't right. When we arrived back at Mike's house that night, I threw the jeans inside on the counter, then we both washed upstairs. Talking as we both came down the steps, Mike got real serious and said to me, "Why the hell did you leave the sliding glass door open? Animals could get into the house." As I peered around the steps to see what he was talking about, I could see that the glass door was sprung open, and I could feel the cold Ohio air in the house. I proclaimed my innocence and accused him of just trying to scare me. We closed the door, checked the house to make sure no animals got in. His house was back in the woods for all you city folks listening and wondering why would animals be coming into the house. We crashed on his couch for a movie before bed. We were barely into the movie when I heard Mike yell, "Jesus!" and he jumped off the couch, which scared me. I began screaming and ran behind the couch. He ran out of the room. I followed him as he explained to me that someone was in the window, peering into the living room. I asked who he saw. He said it was some kind of weird-looking person, maybe toddler size. I was relieved to hear that because I figured he was trying to scare me with some melonhead crap and was thankful it wasn't a real burglar. But my relief turned back into fear as Mike came back into the room checking the bullets in a shotgun that his dad kept to protect the cattle from predators. Mike never, and I mean never, touches a gun. So when I saw him holding it point blank, things got real. We flicked on every floodlight we had outside, and I grabbed a knife as we walked slowly outside, staying near the house just to be in the light. That's when I saw it. Well, not well, but I knew what I saw. I could see it. I think it was the back of it, as it was about 3 to 4 feet tall. It was a shadow, kind of like a small child running along the line of the woods. While my eyes were still focused on it, I heard a loud bang! And I nearly jumped out of my freaking skin. Mike, who never held a gun in his life, to my knowledge, shot at the shadow along the wood line. The shadow thing, I don't know what else to call it, never changed its pace as it kept moving farther outside. We didn't chase it because we weren't leaving the light of the house. Once it moved out of sight, we ran back into the house and we locked every door, loaded the gun, and we called his dad. I then looked at Mike and said, "I'm bringing those freaking jeans back to that spot." After yelling at me for taking the jeans, which he had no problem with when I did it earlier, Mike said, "We need to take those jeans back now." I said, "You're out of your mind if you think I'm going back into those woods in the middle of the night." That night we slept with the door locked and a loaded gun until sunrise. As the sunlight finally cracked, it was the light we needed, and I grabbed the jeans off the counter and went to go throw them into my trunk to return them to the Melonhead house. When I went to throw them in my trunk, I noticed the trunk was already open. Not fully open, but it was definitely opened. We checked the inside of the car at gunpoint and then drove off back to the Melonhead house. Shotgun in hand, we walked back to the spot where I grabbed the jeans without saying a word. I threw those jeans down where I got them, and we made our way back to my car. When we both got in, we took a deep breath and never went back to that house again. That was 11 years ago, and since then, we never have had another visit by what we saw at the house. But now that we both live in a different state, we'll joke about it from time to time, but only with each other. To this day, the only other person that knew was his dad, and he thinks we shot at a possum. But the two of us, we've lived in the woods nearly our entire lives, and we have master's degrees in our fields, and I can tell you, that was no damn possum.
Beyond the darkness.
Welcome back to the best in paranormal talk radio. This is Beyond the Darkness. I'm Tim Dennison for Dave Schrader, who will be back on Monday with supernatural news and Parashare. Remember, if you've got a story that you want to share with us, be sure to email Dave at dave@darknessradio.com, and we'll be glad to get your story on the air. It doesn't have to be in the Midwest, but you know what? We're talking about stories in the Midwest, and we're talking about different macabre stories of the Midwest. Our guest is Chad Lewis. Chad has a brand new book out called The Most Gruesome Hauntings in the Midwest. So we're talking about only the most gruesome of these hauntings in the Midwest. One of the ones that has always fascinated me, and believe it or not, Chad, made me afraid to fly in the Midwest. And one of my first radio interviews had to do with flying in a small plane, having to go to Iowa and flying in a small plane, has to do with Buddy Holly. And the first thing that I thought about having to get in a small Cessna, and I had to co-pilot, by the way, with this co-owner of this radio station, was flying from Minnesota. I had to drive from Minnesota to La Crosse, Wisconsin, getting in this Cessna, and then flying over the border. And when you fly over the border, you see the trees go from plush, green, and plentiful to none. You know you're in Iowa when the trees disappear. And as you're in this small plane, and I'm looking at the co-owner of the radio station. I look at him and I said, in my mind at that point, Buddy Holly enters into my head in that plane crash, and I say to him, "What happens if an engine drops out of this Cessna?" And he says to me, "Well, we glide in." And I said, "Glide into where?" And he said, "We glide into a cornfield, or we glide into a road, or we glide into wherever it is we land, and we land." Mm-hmm. And the only thing I'm thinking is Buddy Holly and crashing, and that's it, and we're done. And I said, "Well, you remember Buddy Holly, right?" And he laughs and goes, "Not every plane landing is Buddy Holly." Mm-hmm. And just kind of like, oh, come on, that's not how every plane lands, or that's not how every every plane malfunction happens. That's otherwise planes would be falling out of the sky left and right. Set it up for us a little bit. What happened that day with Buddy Holly? And what's going on now in that area where his plane crashed?
Sure. It was February of 1959. Buddy Holly, one of the biggest stars on the planet at that time, was touring with Ritchie Valens and the Big Bopper, J.P. Richardson. They were playing the Surf Ballroom in downtown Clear Lake, Iowa, and Buddy Holly was upset because their tour bus kept freezing up and breaking down on him. So he hired a small plane to take him and the two other artists up to the Fargo, North Dakota area for their next gig. So the plane took off. The next morning, when they had not arrived in Fargo, a search party was sent out. And just north of Clear Lake, Iowa, they found the crashed remains in a field where the young, inexperienced pilot and all three of the artists were dead on site. And it became known as the day that music died. And since that time, many people have gone out to the area. There's a memorial there with giant glasses, Buddy Holly glasses, and a marker in honor of the three artists. And many people have gone out there to pay their respects to the artists, and they take comfort and solace in the fact that the music of these men will live on forever. But many people who visit this site believe that it's more than the music that continues on, because they'll actually see the ghost of Buddy Holly. They'll hear music being played, but when they look around, it's just surrounded by fields. People have seen what appears to be a plane crashing into the field, but no plane can ever be found. So it's one of those places where it seems that history has somehow fated those three artists to some part, at least, remain on the site where they met their end.
Can you imagine if that residual haunting just happened over and over and over again, much like a residual haunting at Gettysburg, or something that just continued to happen, like a tape playing over and over and over again, that fateful moment. It just seems to me like that tragedy, that scar on the earth happening over and over again would be so tragic that that sends chills down my spine.
It does, and the fact that if it is the ghost of Buddy Holly haunting the place, he seems to be busier in death than he was in life, because several places around the country all claim to be the home of Buddy Holly's ghost, including him being seen at the Surf Ballroom where he played his last show.
That would be a busy ghost, wouldn't it, if he were in different places at one time? Well, let me ask you this. Do you believe that your ghost could splinter, or your spirit could splinter and be in different places?
I always say that when you're dealing with the weird, what is too weird? Where do you draw that line? And I think anything's possible, because in my 20-some years, I'm left with more questions than answers. That we often think of a ghost being attached to one area, usually where it met its death or its favorite location or a cemetery, something along that nature. But what's to say that it couldn't appear in 25 different places at once? And in my research, I've always held to that idea of nothing is too weird to at least consider. Because if you were to say things were too weird to investigate, we'd have no stories of chupacabras running around, or black-eyed children, or people being abducted by aliens. All this would be too weird to even investigate, much like it was for Project Blue Book when they were investigating UFO sightings, that if there was a sighting with an inhabitant aboard the craft, they wouldn't even research it because they thought it was too bizarre. It couldn't happen. We will look at UFOs, but not UFOs with occupants. Yeah. So those are the cases that fascinate me, though, the ones that are so strange and bizarre.
Let me ask you this, because I had a thought here. You mentioned that they see Buddy Holly in different places in different areas. This is going to seem like a bizarre thought, but do you ever watch the show Preacher on AMC?
I have not seen it, no.
Okay, there's a concept that they come up with that on the show, and actually it was when it was a graphic novel comic book. It was come up with by Garth Ennis, I believe, and the idea is that hell was more of a replay of your life, and it happened over and over and over and over again. But you had to, in order to get out of hell, you had to somehow break the cycle of the replay, much like a residual haunting. You're stuck in this residual haunting over and over and over again until you figure out a way to break the cycle. So in one of these, this is going to seem bizarre, but in the show, there's a character named Eugene who's banished to hell by the preacher in the show, who has this celestial gift. It's actually an alien who's stuck inside of him, but this alien that's stuck inside of him is actually a celestial being as well, whose voice can force you to do whatever it is that he says you're supposed to do. So, I know I'm getting off track here, but in a moment of anger, he banishes Eugene to hell, and so he falls into hell, and he's trying to find his way out, but he's stuck at a point, and he's literally got what he calls an arse face, because he had tried to commit suicide after his girlfriend committed suicide in front of him. And he put a shotgun in his mouth and pulled the trigger. But when he did so, his face collapsed, but he lived. So his face looks like you can figure it out, like an anus, right?
Right.
So he's in hell, and he's trying to figure out how to get out. And believe it or not, this is going to sound like it's set up for a punchline. He's stuck there with Adolf Hitler, and Adolf Hitler is trying to help him get out of hell. I know this sounds weird.
I like this.
But at the time, as he's trying to help him get out of hell, he's replaying the scene with his girlfriend where she's committing suicide over and over and over again. And he's trying to work through his emotional trauma in order to try and get out. And that's the only way that he can get out of hell, is by replaying the scene over and over and over again until he figures it out. Until he figures out that it's her own hang-ups of her being almost narcissistic and wanting to take her life to draw attention to herself, and that he doesn't have to follow her in her footsteps and try to commit suicide himself, and that he can walk away from the situation, that he can escape hell. I know it sounds very weird and I'm getting off track, but what if Buddy Holly appearing in all these places on Earth, listen to me, I sound like I've already been hitting the bong this afternoon. What if Buddy Holly appearing on all these places on Earth is his own version of hell, where he's reliving everything, that last night at the Surf's Ballroom, the plane crashing in the field, and he's replaying all of this over and over and over again on Earth until he can figure out how to get out of that situation and move on to the light.
Great theory. And again, we don't know if we buy into the fact that there are such things as residual hauntings, that the environment, if you will, has recorded something and plays it over and over and over. What limits it to one place? True. Or one time, or one decade, or, who knows, one dimension.
True. I wonder about things like that, because when people say, there's no such thing as hell, I don't buy that. I don't know why in my tiny little pea brain I don't buy that theory. Because I gotta think, not that there's payment or penance for ill will or wrongdoing, just that that maybe sometimes we get stuck. We get stuck in a traumatic moment at the end of our lives, and maybe we need a way out. We need to figure a way out in order to move on. Kind of like when your car breaks down, when the engine seizes and we got to get it to the junkyard. You got to figure out how to get it there.
Well, we certainly think of hauntings as being a lot of them anyway, of traumatic experiences, whether it is the serial killers, the untimely accidents, the suicides, the murders, things of that nature. We think that it's so traumatic that they somehow force, or it's fate that they are now living on as spirits. even though I get a ton of reports every year from people who believe it's their family member haunting their house and it's not scary, they really like it because they believe it's a relative coming back to let them know they're in a better place. But that's not where most of the national media is focused, or the movies. That's not scary, having grandpa to come back and give you some great advice. It's scarier when it's a mysterious creature or, demon type ghost coming back.
Now, there are members of Buddy Holly's family that are still alive, right? That are still. Are they?
I would assume so, yes. I don't know, but I would assume. I don't know if he had children. I'm guessing no, because he was relatively young. But extended family, certainly.
Because I thought I remembered seeing something on television about there are still surviving family members, and I don't remember what I was watching. I guess I'll wave that thought off, because it had something to do with royalties from recordings, but. I got to think that they visit some of these, for lack of a better term, shrines that are there. The crash site in Clear Lake, or even the ballroom. Would you? And I'll ask this question just of you, Chad. If you were one of the family members, the surviving family members, would you go to these shrines or these areas where he was supposedly his ghost was seen? Would you want to make contact with these ghosts and these sightings, or would you just want to leave it lie and see if he would just move on?
I certainly would like to. I think for a lot of us that have lost people, whether it's someone very close, immediate family, or ancestors upon ancestors, that a lot of people are trying to get closer to their family ties of the ancestors they never knew. And unfortunately, for a lot of us that have ancestors from a long ago, it wasn't possible to have something like a video of them, or sometimes not even a photograph. So if there's some place, a shrine or a last location, I think it would make you feel closer to that loved one by visiting, regardless of whether or not you believe in ghosts.
Let's move on a little bit within this book. Give me one of your more favorite stories out of the book. One of your more favorite ones to research.
Well, let me use the word favorite in a weird form here, because this was one of the cases that stuck with me and affected me the longest. That when you work on a book about all the terrible tragedies I just mentioned of suicides and the like, you spend a couple years in this world, it can't help but to cloud and change a bit who you were. During the 2 years that I was working on this, I had some of the weirdest dreams I'd ever had. And a lot of it was not so much being afraid of the ghosts and spirits, but the monster we call human nature. And one of my favorite, or least favorite, depending on how you want to look at it, cases happened down in Illinois in a small town called Cambridge. And for decades, people talked about this curved road out in the country being called Death Curve. And it received its name because the legend of the dare was that if you were foolish or brave enough to go out to this curve, as you made your way around the curve, a woman with a giant axe would appear in the middle of the road, run you off the road, you'd crash and die, hence the name Death Curve. Well, I started doing research on this legend and found one of the worst stories I'd ever heard, that back in 1905, a family lived out on Death Curve. They were the Markham families, and it was a husband and wife and their 7 children. And one day when the father was out working, the mother, Julia Markham, sent her 2 oldest and strongest kids off to go get some water and some wood for the day. When they were gone, one by one, she invited her 5 youngest children into the house, where she decapitated them with an axe.
Ooh.
When the 2 older children came back, they were treated to the same behavior. And then, just like as we were talking about with Ed Gein, she snapped out of her trance, saw what she had done, tried to slit her own throat. It didn't work, so she grabbed some coal oil, poured it all over the remains of her children, and started her house on fire. Neighbors, seeing the smoke of the house, came rushing over just in time to see Mrs. Markham stumble out of the house looking like some charred Freddy Krueger. She collapses on the front yard. A doctor is summoned. He tells her that she's not going to make it, and she confesses to killing all 7 of her children.
Man.
And now people believe those children and the woman all haunt this area of Death Curve. And it was one of those, again, Tim, that, yes, it's scary of a woman with a bloody axe chasing you. It's a lot scarier when your mother calls you into the house and has an axe ready to take off your head.
Yeah. Oh, my gosh. Oh.
So what's interesting about this case as well is right down the road, literally from the old house that burned down, of course, is the graveyard where the mother's buried in one unmarked grave and what was left of all the children was buried in another one. And people often ask about the husband, and the newspapers of that time said that the husband actually committed suicide the night after returning and finding his family wiped out. But what I found is just recently is that he did not. The papers were wrong. He actually lived on. He moved out of the area and remarried.
Really?
Which makes sense. If something like that happened, you'd probably want to get out of that area.
Yeah. Well, why do you suppose the twist in the story? Why do you, just for closure? Do you think it was just a cleaner ending to say, for people to say, well, he committed suicide and that's the end of it, and it was the honorable thing to do for him? Or does it just look shady for him to move on and start a new family? Or why that ending? Why change the end of the story?
I think some of the newspapers, in my opinion, just got it wrong. They weren't local papers. They picked up the story, may have heard it from far away investigating that they were doing. And that might have been the legend going around, but it was a local newspaper that actually said sometime later, no, that's not the truth. I actually spoke with the father recently that he's still alive. So I don't know if it was an honest mistake or if it sold more newspapers, because many of the headlines of this case were pretty dramatic. One that I put in the book has big headline, "Mother kills her children, slays them by cutting their throats with an axe as they entered house." Something you would sell a lot of newspapers back then. Right. Yeah.
That's just bizarre. I mean, I get the, you want the nice tied up ending to, the father is so filled with grief that he ends his own life, and it's this tragic story that everyone can rally around. But I don't know. It's bizarre how things get reported. That's for sure.
And they didn't even leave it at that. I mean, they had a very elaborate way of which he went out to the barn and put a rope around his neck and then shot himself and fell onto the rope. So they had a whole story concocted about how he actually did it.
Geez, so there's a whole narrative.
And for years, that was the truth. I had put it in other books I had done years ago because we had never come across any other version of that story. And that's what I love about these legends and folklores, that they're always moving, they're progressing, they're never staying still, that the stories always change, whether the real history or not is accurate. I'll talk to seniors in an area that remember a legend from when they were kids, and then you talk to teenagers and they have a slightly different version of that same legend because it's like the old telephone game. Mm-hmm. It's just changed over the years.
Very interesting indeed. You have a story in the book about John Dillinger, and we've talked about John Dillinger before, even on True Crime Tuesday. And there is the story of his death, which is very unusual. Give us a little detail about John Dillinger and refresh us a little bit about John Dillinger and his story.
I love the story of John Dillinger. I don't know if I would have liked getting in his way when he was trying to rob a bank, but I'm fascinated by our fascination of Dillinger. And for those who don't recall, Dillinger was a bank robber back in 1933 when he got out of prison. He had served almost a decade in jail down in Illinois for robbing a small store, grocery store, where he was told that if he pleaded guilty, the judge would have leniency on him. That did not happen. So he got out of prison in 1934 and went on about a 14-month rampage where he became the most infamous bank robber perhaps in all of history, certainly of the 1930s Prohibition era. And Dillinger was a bank robber. He wasn't really involved with the bootlegging, and unlike other gangsters, if you will, that were stationary in a certain location like Al Capone or Bugs Moran and the like, Dillinger was more of a freelancer. He went everywhere. He wasn't involved with drugs, prostitution, gambling. He didn't control any of that. He was more of a bank robber on the road, out there, becoming one of the most famous criminals of all time.
Now, with Dillinger, actually, interestingly enough, Dillinger had his run here in St. Paul, and came through St. Paul for a little while, and we were doing it. We were at an event that Chip Coffey was doing here in St. Paul at the Caves, Wabasha Street Caves, and there's a right by the fireplace. There are bullet holes in the actual fireplace, where I don't remember how the story goes, to be exact. But it was believed that Dillinger was shot at, I think is what it was.
Well, there are several versions of the story. The one I originally heard 20 years ago when I toured the Street Caves, which was an old speakeasy back in Prohibition days, was that there was a card game going on late at night, and 4 men were playing cards, and the waitress thought it was odd because all of the men carried with them a large musical instrument case, although none of them played any instruments. And when she was out topping off their drinks, she heard the sound of a Tommy gun going off, and when she came back, 3 of the men were dead or on the ground dying, and the man with the Tommy gun ran out, and she said that when she called the police, they threatened to arrest her. They cleaned up the area, and she said those bodies, they were buried in the back of the caves, where legend is they still remain to this very day. We don't know if it was Dillinger that was shot or doing the shooting, but we do know Dillinger was there, and he spent a lot of time in St. Paul. One of his best crime buddies, Homer Van Meter, was actually killed on University Avenue, and Dillinger was shot at in the apartments he was staying at.
That's right. That's what it was. And I seem to remember that when Chip was there, he had asked, I don't remember which spirit was there, for confirmation that Dillinger was there when the bullets were fired or something like that, and he had gotten confirmation that Dillinger was there. So it was kind of an interesting deal, but it was that was kind of a cool moment. So.
And of course, Dillinger is one of those ghosts, if you will, that has, like Buddy Holly, he's been known to be many places, but the most infamous is that of the Biograph Theater down in Chicago, where he was gunned down in 1934 in the alleyway there. Mm-hmm. And many people believe that his spirit is still at the Biograph or in that alleyway. And one of the great traditions I never got to do before they stopped doing it was on the anniversary of Dillinger's death. You used to be able to go to the Biograph Theater and watch the same movie Dillinger was watching when he was gunned down that night, Manhattan Melodrama. So you could feel like you were in the 1930s watching the same movie and coming out of the Biograph and hopefully not getting shot.
Well, hopefully, yeah. Wow, that would be really cool. That would be a really cool experience. So, that tie to actually the tie here in Minnesota to the different gangsters of Chicago is really, really quite cool. There's the other tie too. I think it's White Bear Lake was where Ma Barker used to have her summer home. Is that? Yeah,
in Matamidi area in White Bear Lake, Ma Barker and her sons, who ran the Barker Carpus gang, mostly made up of whatever Barker boys were alive or out of prison, and Elvin Creepy Carpus. They hung out quite a bit in White Bear Lake and Matamidi and all the resorts. They would flash their money around, and then, of course, they'd rob the banks on their spare time.
There's that, too. But what was I heard one story, something about she used to make treats for the kids or something like that? Is that what it was?
Yeah, Ma Barker was loved. She was seen as a low intelligence at best woman, that she really had nothing to do with the planning or execution of the gang, their plans. She was just along because her kids were criminals, and that once she was gunned down in Florida and the FBI realized she was an unarmed senior of mild at best intelligence, they concocted this whole idea that she was this mastermind criminal because they thought the American public may not like people going out and shooting unarmed seniors at their house. So those who knew Ma Barker when she died and it became known that she was this great mastermind, they told the media, they started laughing, saying that woman couldn't plan breakfast, much less a bank robbery. But she was loved everywhere she went. Down in Florida, where they had their home where they were renting, where she was gunned down and killed, the local community named their bar Ma Barker's Hideaway, because the neighbors thought these gangsters were they didn't know who they were, but they thought they were the best neighbors you could have. They would give kids candy and quarters and give them rides in their fancy automobiles. And they were the best neighbors to have unless you got in their way, and then they would just shoot you.
Yeah. Yeah. There's definitely some interesting stories, especially here around the Twin Cities, of different gangsters that came through here. And like you said, different interesting stories and good stories of them, which is definitely hard to find. Give us one more from the book, one more of your more interesting macabre stories from the book, which is available right now, folks, on Amazon.com. It's called The Most Gruesome Hauntings of the Midwest by our guest, Chad Lewis.
Let me share with you one of the first cases I ever investigated 20 plus years ago. I just started out researching UFOs, and I got a call from a gentleman. Him and his buddy had been out in a dam area, Elk Lake Dam, right outside of my hometown of Eau Claire, Wisconsin, just out in the country a couple miles. Beautiful area. Okay. They were just sitting there watching the water go by when all of a sudden one of the guys turned around and he saw a glowing woman in white standing behind him. And he nudged his buddy and said, "Hey, do you know there's a glowing woman behind us?" And his buddy said, "Yep, but I'm too afraid to turn around and look." About a half hour went by. They finally got the collective courage to turn around, and the woman was gone. So were the two men. They hightailed it out of there. Jeez. And one of them would not even bring us back to the location where he saw this glowing woman. But the other one did. I brought a psychic with me. We captured some weird photographs of weird mist at the site, which at the time we didn't know because we were using film, real film, 35 millimeter, where you had to have it developed before you saw what was going on. And it comes to be, long story short, a woman was murdered out there in 1974. She was stabbed to death in that area. And now so many people have been out there and seen or heard or felt her ghost. And it's a cursed area. That there was a father and son serial killers out that lived right in that area that would lure people out there and kill them and bury them in the swampy area in their backyard. And one of the neighbors right next to this bridge told me that one day he had borrowed some tools around Halloween from his neighbor, and he went to return them and went in the garage, and he saw what appeared to be a dummy hanging from the rafters in the garage. And he thought it was funny because his neighbor was trying to spook him around Halloween. Well, after several more days of not seeing his neighbor anywhere, the police were called. They came in and found out it was the neighbor hanging from those rafters at the end of a noose. So this area seems to be just cursed with paranormal activity.
Wow. Yikes. Yikes. The book is The Most Gruesome Hauntings of the Midwest. Our guest has been Chad Lewis. Chad, thank you very much for joining us yet again here on Beyond the Darkness. We appreciate you.
Hey, keep an eye out.
We will, definitely. Check out the book right now on Amazon.com. You can pick it up right now in paperback on Amazon if you're a Prime member for just $15.95. And it's going quick, folks. The book, pick it up now because it's flying off the shelf over there at Amazon. So make sure you go and get it right now. Dave will be back on Monday for Supernatural News and for Perisher. Remember, if you've got a story that you want to share with us, email it to Dave@darknessradio.com, and we'll read it on Monday. For Dave Schrader, I'm Tim Dennis. We'll see you on Monday. You've been listening to the best of Paranormal Talk Radio. This is Beyond the Darkness.